There is a particular kind of silence that follows a door slamming shut. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of an empty house on a Sunday morning. This is the silence that presses against your eardrums after something irreversible has just happened, the kind that makes the air feel thicker, heavier, like the world itself has closed a chapter without asking your permission. Margaret Caldwell heard that silence on a Tuesday morning in October. She was 72 years old and she was standing on a concrete porch in her house. Slippers and the door behind her was locked. But we need to go back. We need to go back exactly 14 seconds because that is how long it took for a life to end and another one to begin without Margaret understanding which was which. 14 seconds. That is how long Robert Caldwell stood at the kitchen counter with his back turned to his mother before the decision was made. He did not turn around. He did not speak. He simply lifted his coffee mug, took one slow sip, and set it back down on the granite with a sound so ordinary it was almost obscene. And in those 14 seconds of his silence, his wife, Diane, said everything that needed to be said, did everything that needed to be done. And Robert Caldwell defined himself in a way that no amount of apology would ever fully undo. The narrator needs you to understand something before we go any further. Robert was not a monster. That would make this story simpler, cleaner, easier to file away. Monsters are easy. You recognize them immediately. You know what they are. Robert Caldwell was something far more common and far more devastating. He was a man who had learned somewhere along the years that silence was cheaper than decision, that looking away cost less than looking at something and having to respond to it. He was a man who had let 14 seconds become 8 years and then let 8 years become this. The suitcase hit the front porch first. It was a gray, hard-sided case, 22 inches, the kind Margaret had owned since before Robert was in high school. The latch caught the edge of the top step and the whole thing buckled open and the clothes inside went everywhere. A blue cardigan landed on the wet concrete. A pair of slacks draped themselves over the iron railing. A small toiletry bag skidded to the edge of the step and stopped just short of falling into the dying grass below. Then came the hand between her shoulder blades. Not violent, not the push of someone trying to hurt her. Just firm, certain. The push of someone who has already moved past the point of second-guessing and is now simply completing a task. Diane's hand. Margaret stumbled forward, caught the railing with both palms and steadied herself. She turned around. The deadbolt turned, then the door chain slid into place. Margaret stood there breathing. The October air was cold enough to see her breath. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had gripped the railing, and she noticed they were not shaking. She found that interesting. A distant observational part of her brain made note of it the way you might notice the weather. She looked down at the rest of her. House slippers. The foam-soled kind, pale blue, meant for shuffling between the bedroom and the kitchen in the morning. Not meant for concrete, not meant for stairs, not meant for whatever came next. In the right pocket of her housecoat, from a trip to the corner drugstore the week before, she found $2 bills and a handful of change. She pressed them into her palm and counted slowly. $2.35. That was her entire net worth on this earth. She stood on that porch for a full minute, not frozen, thinking. Because here is what you need to understand about Margaret Caldwell. She had been through enough in 72 years that panic was not a first response. Panic was a luxury. Panic required the belief that someone was coming to help. Margaret had long since stopped expecting that. She bent down. She gathered what she could from the scattered clothes, folded each piece with the same care she had used every morning for 8 years when she made her a bed in the spare room, and pressed them back into the broken suitcase. She tied the broken latch shut with a shoelace she pulled from her left slipper. She picked up the case. She walked down the porch steps and turned left. Nobody on that street looked twice. Now you need to understand how she got to that porch. Because the suitcase and the $2 and the blue house slippers are not the beginning of the story. They are the end of one chapter and the first sentence of another. The beginning goes back 8 years to a Saturday morning in a garage in eastern Pennsylvania when Gerald Caldwell was changing the oil on his truck and his heart stopped between one breath and the next. Gerald had handled the money, all of it. The bills, the taxes, the savings, the investments, every single dollar that moved through their household had moved through Gerald's hands first. Margaret had cooked and raised three children and maintained a house and managed 1,000 invisible logistics every single day for 40 years. But the finances had been Gerald's domain, and she had let them be his domain because that was how it was done in their house, because Gerald had preferences about certain things, and Margaret had learned early in their marriage which preferences were worth challenging and which ones were not. When the dust settled after the funeral, she found out there was nothing left. A second mortgage she had never signed, three credit cards she had never seen, debts going back years, quiet and accumulating in accounts she did not know existed. Gerald had not been malicious. She believed that. He had been a man who handled problems by hiding them and hoped the numbers would eventually work themselves out. They had not. The bank took the house 6 months after the funeral. The car followed, then most of the furniture. Margaret walked out of that foreclosure with 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums, and she stood on the sidewalk in front of the house where she had raised her children, and she thought, this is what 72 years of building something looks like when it's gone. Robert had been the one to offer, her oldest 49 years old with a house in a Philadelphia suburb and a spare room with a window that faced the backyard. He had said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mom needs a place. We have a room. She can stay with us. And for a while, maybe the first year it had worked the way Robert said it would. But accommodations have a way of becoming arrangements. And arrangements have a way of becoming burdens, and burdens have a way of being felt long before they are spoken. Here is the shape of 8 years told in 5 moments. Year 1, Robert carries a last box into the spare room. He says, "This is your home now, Mom. Don't worry about anything." Margaret thanks him and begins to unpack, and the first thing she puts out, the very first thing, is a small black and white photograph she has carried since before Robert was born. A young woman standing in front of a stone cottage somewhere in upstate New York, arms crossed loosely at her waist, looking directly into the camera with an expression that is not quite a smile and not quite defiance, but something in between, something that says, "I know you're watching and I don't mind." Margaret tapes it carefully to the wall above the dresser. She looks at it for a moment. Then she goes to help Diane with the dinner. Year 2, Margaret has taken over the cooking, not because anyone asked, because it is the most natural way to make herself useful. And making herself useful is the language of survival she learned long ago. Diane says thank you each evening for the first 3 months. Then she stops saying thank you and begins commenting. Instead, a little too much salt, or the chicken could have gone another 5 minutes, or we don't usually eat this late. Margaret adjusts each thing. She does not take it personally. This is the deal. You live in someone else's house, you conform to their preferences. She understands that. Year 4, Claire is 13 years old and sitting at the dinner table on a Wednesday evening, and she says without malice, without any awareness of what she is saying, "Grandma, don't you ever get tired of just sitting here?" Diane does not correct her. Robert laughs, the short, reflexive laugh of someone who doesn't know what else to do. Margaret puts her spoon down, picks it up, continues eating. But that night, after everyone is asleep, she takes the black and white photograph down from the wall. She does not know why. She only knows that something in the house has changed, and she does not want the photograph seen here. She puts it in the drawer of the nightstand. That is where it stays for the next 4 years. Year 6, Robert loses his job in February. The arguments start in March, not loud ones, but the pressurized kind, the kind that happened behind closed doors at a volume just above a whisper. Margaret hears the shape of them through the wall. She begins to eat less at dinner. She turns the lights off earlier. She stops running the heat in her room at night, even when the temperature drops into the 20s, sleeping instead in 2 sweaters and wool socks. Nobody asks her to do any of this. She simply does it because she has been living in other people's spaces long enough to understand that the less you cost, the longer you are allowed to stay. Year 7, late on a Thursday night through the wall, Clearly Diane's voice saying either she goes or I go. 4 seconds of silence. Then Robert's voice careful and low, I'll talk to her. He never does. Margaret lies in her room listening to the silence on the other side of that wall, and she understands that the 4 seconds of her son's silence was not him thinking. It was him deciding. And he had decided against her. That was year 7. This is year 8, last chapter. Diane placed 3 brochures on the kitchen table on a Monday morning. Senior living communities, color photographs of smiling people in sunlit common rooms, men playing chess, women doing watercolor. Margaret looked at them without touching them. Then she looked at Robert, who was standing by the coffee maker with his back to her. Robert, she said. He did not turn around. Look at me. 3 seconds. 5. He turned. His eyes went to the left of her face, not to her eyes. She had seen that look before on people who owed money they were not going to pay back. Is there anything you want to say to me? The coffee maker beeped. Robert reached for his mug. He wrapped both hands around it, looked down at the counter, and said nothing. That was his answer. That was the entirety of his answer. 49 years of being her son, and when it mattered most, he held a coffee mug and looked at the counter. Margaret stood up. She collected her half-eaten toast and her orange juice glass, and she brought them to the sink, and she rinsed them. Every motion careful, every motion deliberate. She dried her hands on the dish towel and hung it back on the oven handle the way she had every morning for 8 years. Then she walked to her room and began to pack. She did not have much. 8 years in a house, and she had accumulated almost nothing. The clothes were hers, the photo albums were hers, a few books, the reading glasses in 3 different pairs because she could never remember where she put them. She moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who has packed and unpacked in a hurry before folding rather than stuffing, thinking about weight distribution because the latch on this suitcase had always been temperamental. She opened the nightstand drawer, the black and white photograph. The woman in front of the stone cottage, arms crossed, looking at the camera like she already knew everything that was going to happen. Margaret held the photograph for a moment. Then she tucked it into the inside pocket of her winter coat. 4 years in that drawer. She was not going to leave it behind. Diane came to the door at 11:15. She said the timeline had changed. She said a friend had called about a facility with an opening today, right now, and wasn't that lucky. She was holding the suitcase by the handle before she finished the sentence. Margaret said, I'd need 1 more day. Diane said no. That was the sum of it. No negotiation. No acknowledgement of 8 years of dinners cooked and groceries bought with her own pension check and grandchildren driven to school and homework checked and a spare room kept spotless because she understood she was a guest and guests did not impose. No acknowledgement of any of it. Just no. The suitcase hit the porch. The latch broke. The hand between her shoulder blades was not angry. That was the worst of it. It was efficient, like carrying a box to the curb. And now Margaret stood on the sidewalk outside the house with $2.35 in her palm and a suitcase tied shut with a shoelace and no phone, no wallet, no keys, no plan. She began to walk. The neighborhood was the kind that had been ordinary for so long, it had forgotten it was ordinary. Lawns at regulation length, recycling bins in the correct positions. 3 houses down, a man was trimming the edge of his driveway with a string trimmer, and he looked up when she passed, and he looked back down. At block 6, the left sole of her slipper began to peel away from the foam base. She could feel it catching, with each step, a small drag, a small announcement of everything that was wrong about the situation. She kept walking. At block 8, she stopped. There was a drugstore on the corner, the same one she had walked to every week for 8 years to pick up her prescriptions and sometimes a loaf of bread. The window was lit from inside. Through the glass, she could see the end-of-aisle displays, the reading glasses rack the checkout counter, where a young woman was looking at her phone with the particular stillness of someone pretending to be busy. Margaret stood at that window for a long moment. She could go in. She could tell the young woman at the counter what had just happened. She could say, I am 72 years old and I was just put out of my son's house with $2 and I do not know what to do next. Someone would help. Someone would call someone. She did not go in, not because she was too proud. That kind of pride had been squeezed out of her a long time ago. She did not go in because she realized standing there in her house slippers looking at her own reflection in the drugstore window that she did not know what she needed yet. And she was not going to ask for help until she understood what she was asking for. Her reflection looked back at her. Gray hair, some of it pulled loose from where she had pinned it that morning before everything happened. Winter coat over a house dress. One slipper with a peeling sole. She looked at herself the way you look at a stranger on the street with that brief clinical assessment before you look away. She thought there was a woman who has been made small for a very long time. She turned away from the window and kept walking. The bus station was 11 blocks from Robert's house, and she had walked it exactly once before 3 years ago when Robert's car was in the shop and she needed to get to the pharmacy in the next town over. She remembered the way. She reached it in just under 40 minutes, by which point the left slipper had given up entirely, the sole flapping with every step, and she was walking on the ball of her foot to compensate. Inside the station, there were molded plastic chairs the color of old mustard and a departures board in a single-service window, staffed by a man in his 40s with a permanent crease between his eyebrows, of someone who has processed a lot of people's worst days. His name tag said Pete. Margaret stood at this window. She looked at the departures board. There was one route that went north toward the New York state line, toward the Catskill foothills, toward a cluster of small towns that included one she had not thought about in years and yet could not stop thinking about now. Millhaven, New York. She had not been there since she was 18 years old. She had left on a bus going south and she had not gone back. Not for holidays, not for her mother's funeral, not once in 54 years. She had told herself she would go back someday. Someday had just arrived in a form she had not anticipated. The one-way fare to the closest stop was $1.90. She counted the coins onto the counter. Pete watched her without expression. When she got to the last few, he looked up at her face, then at the tied-shut suitcase on the floor beside her, then at the house slippers. "You sure you want to do this?" he said. "Last bus back doesn't run until tomorrow." "I know," Margaret said. She placed the final coins. "I don't need a bus back." Pete looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to his terminal and printed a ticket. He pushed it through the slot. Then he turned away, opened the mini fridge behind the counter, and came back with a small plastic bottle of water. He set it on the counter beside the ticket and went back to his screen without comment. Margaret looked at the bottle. She picked it up. She found a seat at the back of the waiting area, the broken suitcase between her feet, and she sat with the ticket in one hand and the water bottle in the other. She pulled out the black and white photograph from her coat pocket. Dorothy Whitmore. That was her mother's name. The photograph had been taken sometime in the early 1960s, before Margaret was born, when Dorothy was perhaps 25. She was standing in front of a small stone and timber cottage somewhere in the hills north of Millhaven. Her arms were crossed loosely at her waist. She was looking directly into the camera, not smiling, not tense, just looking with a quality of attention that Margaret had never fully understood. As a child, she had thought her mother simply did not like having her picture taken. As a teenager, she had thought it was stubbornness. As an adult, she had stopped thinking about it at all. Now, sitting in a bus station with 45 cents to her name, she looked at the photograph and thought about it for the first time in decades. Dorothy looked like someone who knew the photograph would be examined long after she was gone. She looked like someone who was trying to communicate something across a distance too large for words. The bus arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. Margaret found a window seat near the back. The bus filled partially, not crowded, the kind of midweek afternoon travel that draws people with specific quiet purposes. A woman in her 50s fell asleep within 10 minutes of departure. A man across the aisle ate a ham sandwich from a paper bag and offered nothing to anyone, which was his right. Margaret did not expect anything from him. She drank the water Pete had given her in small sips to make it last. She had not eaten since the half-consumed piece of toast she had left on the table that morning. Her stomach had gone past hunger, into that quiet, hollow stillness that comes when the body accepts what the mind is still processing. She held the photograph in her lap for most of the drive north. At some point in the third hour, the woman beside her stirred and woke and glanced over. Her eyes went to the photograph. "Is that someone you know?" she asked. "My mother," Margaret said. "I haven't been back to see her in a long time." The woman nodded in the way that people do when they sense there is more to a sentence than the sentence contains. She did not ask anything else. The bus rolled through Pennsylvania and into New York, and the land changed the way it always does. In that transition, the terrain gathering itself into hills, the spaces between towns widening the sky, taking on a different quality as the light came through thicker tree cover. Margaret watched it through the window. She had grown up in these hills. She had run from them at 18 with the specific desperation of someone who believes that geography is fate, that if you can just get far enough away from the place where bad things happened, the bad things will not be able to follow. She had been wrong about that. The bad things had followed her all the way to Pennsylvania, and they had lived in the walls of Gerald's house and then in the walls of Robert's spare room, and they had never had anything to do with geography at all. The bus pulled off the main highway at dusk onto a two-lane road that wound through increasingly sparse country. A gas station, a grain elevator dark against the purple sky, a water tower with Millhaven painted on it in letters that had faded to the color of old rust. The bus stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. 4 passengers got off. Margaret was the last. She stood in the parking lot in the cooling October dark suitcase on the ground beside her, house slippers on the asphalt. The air smelled like pine and turned leaves and something cold coming down from the north. She could see her breath. She went into the gas station and asked the clerk for directions to the old Whitmore property. The clerk, a teenager with no particular interest in the question, shrugged. But a woman at the coffee machine 50s wearing a Carhartt jacket turned around. She gave Margaret specific directions. Past the grain elevator, past the old school on the left, down a gravel road that follows the creek east for about a mile. Stone house set back from the road. "You related to the Whitmores?" the woman asked. "She was my mother," Margaret said. The woman in the Carhartt jacket nodded slowly the way people in small towns nod when new information is settling into a context they are still working out. She did not say anything else, and Margaret did not wait for her to. She walked. The gravel road was hard going in the dark. There was no street light past the grain elevator, only the ambient glow from the town behind her and the faint silver of the quarter moon above the tree line. The left slipper was fully without a sole by the third block of gravel. She pulled it off and carried it walking on one bare foot in one foam sole, feeling every stone. By the time the ground began to soften into earth rather than gravel, her feet were bleeding. Not badly, enough to feel. She did not stop. She found the iron gate at the end of a long, overgrown drive. One post had fallen inward, the gate listing at an angle held in place by nothing more than the weeds that had grown up through it over the decades. Margaret pushed through. The weeds came to her waist. The property beyond was completely dark. And then as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. Small, stone foundation. Timber frame above. A tin roof gone the color of dark rust. Shuttered windows on both sides of the front door. 2 boards nailed across the door in an X weather-beaten in gray. Sealed, just like Dorothy's will had instructed 34 years ago. Margaret stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn and looked at the house for a long time. She thought about what she had expected to find here. She had not entirely expected to find it standing. 34 years of abandonment in the Catskill foothills was not nothing. Winters up here were serious. She had half expected a collapsed roof walls gone soft with rot nature, having done what nature does to things that are left alone. But the roof was intact. The walls were standing. Even in the dark and from a distance, the structure had a solidity to it that did not match the years. She went to the collapsed gatepost and found what she was looking for, a length of iron railing broken free at the base lying in the weeds. Heavy enough for leverage. She picked it up, carried it to the porch, tested the third step carefully before putting her weight on it, felt it hold and climbed to the door. 20 minutes. That was how long it took to pull the boards free. The nails were old and had expanded in the wood over decades of freeze and thaw cycles, and they did not come easily. Her palms tore on the rough wood and on the iron of the railing, and the blood made her grip uncertain on the last board, and she had to stop and wipe her hands on her coat twice. But one by one, the boards came away and she leaned them against the porch railing and she stood before the door. She turned the knob. It opened. She had expected the smell first. The smell of a closed house is unmistakable. That particular combination of dampness and age and the slow chemistry of decay. She braced for it as the door swung inward. It did not come. The air that met her was cool and dry and still, clean in a way that made no sense. She stepped across the threshold and stood in the darkness, in the absence of rot, the absence of mold, the absence of every indication of abandonment was so complete that for a moment she thought she had found the wrong house. She stood still, listening. The house was silent in the way that houses are silent when they have been waiting. She found the kitchen drawer by memory, the second one down on the left of the sink where Dorothy had always kept the flashlight. Her hand closed around it in the dark. She clicked it on. The beam swept across white shapes. The furniture was covered in white sheets. They stood in every room like figures at attention, like something out of a house that had been put to sleep, rather than abandoned. Margaret crossed to the nearest one and pulled it off. A wooden rocking chair. Clean, not a fleck of dust on the seat. The wood had a faint shine to it, the particular quality of wax applied over a surface that had already been cleaned. She moved to the kitchen table, pulled its sheet. Maple the wood she remembered from childhood, and the surface was polished cool under her fingertips, sealed in a way that had resisted 34 years of air. She opened the cabinet above the sink, plates stacked, glasses without a crack, a cast iron skillet on its hook, still seasoned black. She opened the drawer by the sink, her mother's kitchen scissors right where they had always been. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with the flashlight in her bloody hand, and she understood something without having words for it yet. This house had not been abandoned. It had been preserved. There was a difference, and the difference was intentional, and the intention had required planning and care, and someone who understood that one day someone would need what was inside these walls. Margaret set the flashlight on the counter so the beam pointed at the ceiling, filling the kitchen with diffused light. She opened the cabinet below the sink. Under the drain pipe, behind a box of old steel wool, she found a bar of beeswax wrapped in cloth. She held it, turned it over. The same brand Dorothy had always used. The cloth it was wrapped in was soft oiled slightly. It had been put there on purpose recently enough that the wax had not hardened to chalk. Someone had been maintaining this house. Not recently, not last month, but within the last few years. Someone had been coming here and keeping it. She was too tired to pursue the thought further. Her feet were bleeding. She had not eaten in 10 hours, and she was standing in her dead mother's kitchen 34 years after she had last been here. She found the blankets in the cedar chest in the bedroom. 3 of them wool-folded with the precision of someone who expected them to be used again. She found a can of peaches on the pantry shelf dated 1991, the wax seal still intact. She opened it with the can opener that was still in the second drawer where it had always been. She sat at the kitchen table and ate peaches in the dark one at a time, and they were still sweet. Then she made a bed on the old Davenport in the sitting room, 2 blankets beneath her, and one on top, and she lay down with her coat still on, and she closed her eyes. She did not dream. Her body had been through too much for dreams. She simply sank into the particular quality of sleep that comes when you have finally stopped moving and your bones have accepted the ground beneath them as real and the world above you as solid and the air around you as safe. She did not know what was waiting for her in the morning. She did not know about the cellar or the letter on the mantelpiece or the 42 acres of land or the $412,000 in a trust account or the birth certificate in the box wrapped in cloth. She did not know yet that her mother had spent half a century building a door that only she could open. She only knew that she was still breathing, that the house was still standing, and that for the first time in 8 years, nobody was going to knock on her door in the morning and tell her the timeline had changed. That was enough. That was more than enough. She slept. The light came before she was ready for it. It pressed through the gaps in the shutters and thin gold lines moved across the sitting room floor as the sun cleared the tree line to the east and landed on Margaret's face with the particular persistence of October morning light that does not apologize for arriving. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was low timber beamed, the wood darkened with age to the color of strong tea. A water stain in the far corner, old and dry, shaped roughly like the state of Florida. She had stared at that same stain as a child lying on this same Davenport on Sunday afternoons when Dorothy made her rest after church. 54 years, and the stain was still there. She sat up slowly. Her feet had stiffened overnight, the cuts along the soles dried to a dark crust. She needed water and food and shoes in approximately that order of urgency. What she had was a coat with blood on the left sleeve and a suitcase full of clothes she had packed in 15 minutes while her daughter-in-law waited outside the door. She went to the kitchen sink. The pipes protested when she turned the handle, a deep metallic groan that traveled through the walls of the house like a complaint lodged from somewhere deep underground. Then the water came cold and brown for the first 10 seconds, then clearer, then running cold and clean. She cupped her hands under it and drank, washed her face, held her hands under the flow until the cuts rinsed open and bled lightly again, then stopped. She was standing at the kitchen window, drying her hands on a dish towel she found on the oven handle when she heard footsteps on the porch. Not tentative footsteps, not the footsteps of someone approaching an abandoned property with caution. These were the footsteps of someone who had climbed these stairs before and knew exactly which ones to trust. Margaret set the dish towel down. She did not reach for anything. She simply turned and waited. The knock was two short raps, businesslike, the knock of someone who expects the door to be answered. She opened it. The woman on the porch was perhaps 65, broad-shouldered, with the kind of outdoor complexion that comes from decades of real weather rather than recreation. She was holding a cloth-wrapped bundle in one hand. She looked at Margaret without surprise, without the awkward recalibration of someone encountering the unexpected. She looked at Margaret the way you look at something you have been waiting to see for a long time. "I saw you come through the gate last night," the woman said, "from my place up the road." "You're the one who told me about the third step," Margaret said. "Lean across." She did not extend her hand. She held out the cloth bundle instead. Inside was a loaf of bread, still faintly warm, and a small crock of butter. "Dorothy told me someone would come eventually. She just didn't say when." Margaret took the bundle. "You knew my mother. I looked after this place for 20 years. She paid me by mail cash in an envelope every November. I never met her after she left, but I knew her instructions well enough." Margaret stepped back from the door. Lena Cross came in, looked around the sitting room with a proprietary assessment of someone who has cleaned a space for 2 decades, nodded once, as if confirming her own work, held up, and turned back to Margaret. "You wax the furniture," Margaret said. "Every spring." She left a written list, 3 pages front and back. Which products for which surfaces, what to check in the foundation, how to read the roof for soft spots. She knew what she was doing. "Why didn't you tell anyone the house was being maintained?" "Because Dorothy didn't want anyone to know. She paid me to keep it, not to talk about it." Those are different jobs. Something in Margaret's chest tightened, the particular sensation of a question that has a sharper edge than it appeared from a distance. "Did she ever say anything about me?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a woman measuring what she had been told against what she was being asked to share. "She said if the right person comes, give them something to eat." Lena's voice was even without sentiment. "I figured you were the right person." Margaret looked at the bread in her hands. Then she looked up. What if the wrong person had come first? Then I was supposed to call a lawyer. Fellow named Fielding in town. She had his number on the list. The name landed in Margaret's mind and stayed there, neither familiar nor entirely foreign, like a word you have heard spoken once in a context you cannot quite place. Lena did not stay long. She was a woman of function over ceremony. She confirmed that the well pump out back still worked. You primed it with a full bucket first, that the wood stove in the sitting room drew well, as long as you kept the flue damper at 45 degrees, and that the cellar entrance was under the braided rug in the pantry if Margaret had not found it yet. Then she left back down the porch steps with the same certainty she had arrived with, turning up the gravel drive without looking back. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her go. Margaret thought Dorothy knew exactly what kind of person to hire. She found the letter 20 minutes later. She had opened the shutters in the sitting room to let the morning in, pulling each one back and latching it against the outer wall, and the light had fallen across the mantelpiece and revealed, half hidden behind a framed photograph she recognized from childhood, a yellow envelope. The envelope was sealed with red wax, the kind that crinkles at the edges when it sets. Her name was on the front in her mother's handwriting. Not Margaret, not Maggie, just her full given name in the careful, upright script Dorothy had used her entire life, as if the act of writing it were worth the attention it took to form each letter correctly. She carried it to this kitchen table. She sat down. She placed it in front of her and looked at it. This was the moment. She understood that without needing to think about it. Everything that came before the bus, the dark road, the porch boards, the long cold night, all of it had been approach. This was arrival. Once she broke that seal, the story would change, and she could not change it back. She broke the seal. 2 pages written front and back on both sheets in the same careful hand as the envelope. The date at the top, November 14th, 1991. Dorothy had written this 11 months before she died. The letter began, "I knew you'd come, not as a wish, as a statement of fact, the way you would write down the address of a place you have been to before." What followed was not what Margaret had expected. There were no apologies in the first paragraph, no expressions of love or regret or the accumulated weight of years. What there was instead was a single line before anything else: "You don't need comfort right now. You need to know what to do next. That is always what you have needed, even when you were small." Margaret stopped reading. She put the letter down on the table face up and sat with that sentence for a moment. 40 years of marriage to Gerald, and he had never understood that about her. 8 years in Robert's house, and nobody there had understood it either. Her own mother, writing from 34 years in the past, had known it with such certainty that she had led with it. She picked the letter back up. "Go to the cellar. The lock combination is your birthday. Month, day, year. Open the door. Everything you need is below. I built it for this moment, even though I never knew exactly what this moment would look like. I knew it would come. I knew you would find your way here when there was nowhere else left to go. I built it for that day." That was the end of the first page. Margaret looked at the pantry door across the kitchen. She thought about Lena Cross saying the cellar entrance is under the braided rug if you haven't found it yet. The same matter-of-fact delivery, as if this were simply a piece of practical information and not the axis around which a woman's entire life was about to turn. She got up. She went to the pantry. She pulled back the braided rug circular. The pattern faded to a soft geometry of browns and greens that she remembered from when she was a child, and the rug had been new. The cellar hatch was set flush with the floorboards, a heavy wooden door with a brass padlock through a hasp, the metal dark with age but solid. She knelt down. The lock was the old 3-number rotary kind, heavy and cold in her hands. She dialed her birthday. October 14, 1953. The shackle opened on the first try. She lifted the hatch. The smell that came up was earth and cedar, cool and dry. The smell of something that had been sealed carefully rather than sealed by neglect. She went back to the kitchen for the flashlight. Then she descended. The cellar stairs were 8 steps wooden, each one solid underfoot. In a way, the porch steps were not. At the bottom, she swept the flashlight around the space and stopped moving. Shelves, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and on every shelf boxes. Not tools, not canning jars, not the accumulated domestic debris of a household. Boxes, banker's bonds in manila folders and leather binders organized with a precision that belonged in a law office rather than underneath a farmhouse in upstate New York. Labels on every box printed in her mother's block capitals. Land, trust, legal, personal. Margaret stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment. Then she reached for the first box. She brought the land box up to the kitchen table and opened it under the full morning light, coming through the windows she had unshuttered. Inside were deeds, Property deeds recorded and notarized and filed with the county clerk's office, each one in a clear sleeve with the original and a copy. She spread them across the table. She counted the cottage and its surrounding lot, expected what she had come for. But the deeds did not stop there. They continued outward in every direction from the property she was standing in. The fields to the north, 40 acres of open ground that she had walked through as a girl without once thinking about who owned them. The forest to the west, another parcel running along the base of a long ridge that she had been told as a child belonged to the county. The creek frontage along the entire eastern boundary, every inch of it, 42 acres total. Every deed in Dorothy Whitmore's name, every one recorded and current. Margaret sat down. She picked up the deed to the north field, the same field she had crossed on her way in last night, pushing through waist-high weeds in the dark, her feet already bleeding. She had been walking on her own land and did not know it. She set the deed down carefully and reached for the trust box. Bank statements from a financial institution in Albany going back to 1971. An account opened with an initial deposit of $5,000. Monthly contributions after that small, at first growing steadily across the decades. 200 a month by the mid-'80s, 500 by the '90s. The most recent statement, printed 6 months ago and addressed to Fielding and Associates of Mill Haven, showed an accumulated balance after 53 years of growth and compounding interest. $412,000. Margaret read that number twice. Then she set the statement down on top of the deed to the north field and looked at the two pieces of paper side by side. 24 hours ago, she had been counting quarters on a bus station counter. She had ridden for 6 hours without food. She had walked a gravel road in the dark with bleeding feet. She had pried boards off a door with a piece of broken iron fence. And under the kitchen floor of the house, she had crawled into like a wounded animal. Her dead mother had left her $412,000 and 42 acres of land. The number did not feel real yet. She did not try to make it feel real. She set it aside the way you set aside information that requires more processing than the current moment allows, and she reached for the legal box. The first thing she found inside was a business card clipped to the inside of the box lid. Old cardstock, soft at the edges with age. Nathan Fielding, attorney at Law Fielding and Associates, an address on Main Street in Mill Haven. The same name Lena Cross had mentioned. The same name on the trust statements. Beneath the card were the letters. Purchase offers. A thick stack of them, each in its original envelope. Each envelope marked "Return to Sender" in red ink, each stamped by the post office as undeliverable, no forwarding address. The return address on every one was the same: Whitaker and Sons Attorneys at Law, Albany, New York. She pulled the oldest envelope from the stack. The postmark read 1987. She pulled the newest, 2019. 32 years of letters, all from the same Albany law firm, all addressed to the estate of Dorothy Whitmore, all returned unopened because Dorothy had arranged for no mail to be forwarded from this address. She opened one from the middle of the stack. The language was professional, carefully neutral, in the way that legal letters are when they are trying to accomplish something they would prefer not to state too directly. It referenced the property at the Mill Haven address. It noted that the estate had been inactive for some years. It expressed interest on behalf of unnamed clients in acquiring the surrounding parcels at a fair market value. It invited the estate's representative to make contact at the earliest convenience. Unnamed clients. But Margaret knew what law firm represented old money in this part of upstate New York. She had grown up here. Everyone in the Catskill foothills knew the name Whitaker. And everyone in a 60-mile radius knew who Whitaker and Sons had represented for 3 generations. The Hargroves. She had not thought of that name in 50 years, not because she had forgotten it, but because there had been no reason to think it. The Hargroves were the kind of family that existed in the background of a place like a geographic feature. They were simply there, permanent, foundational, the way certain families get woven into the fabric of a county when they have been there long enough. Charles Hargrove had built the town library. His family had funded the volunteer fire department. His obituary in 1992 had run on the front page of 3 regional newspapers. She set the letters down and went back to the trust box. She looked at the original deposit, $5,000, 1971. She looked at the name on the account authorization. The account had been opened jointly with Dorothy Whitmore as sole beneficiary and trustee, but the initial capitalization had come from a wire transfer from a private account. The name on that originating account was Charles R. Hargrove. Margaret sat very still. She went back to the cellar. There was a fourth box smaller than the others set apart on the lowest shelf, wrapped in a piece of old canvas tied with twine. No label, she brought it upstairs. Inside the canvas, in a protective plastic sleeve that had kept it perfectly preserved, was a birth certificate. Not the birth certificate she had grown up with. That document, the one she had presented at every government office, every school, every employer for 72 years, listed her father as Harold Webb factory worker of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This document had been issued by a different county on a different date by a different registrar. It listed her father as Charles Raymond Hargrove of Mill Haven, New York. Margaret set it down on the table. She stood up and walked to the back door and opened it. The yard behind the cottage was overgrown the same way the front was, the garden beds long since surrendered to grass and volunteer sumac, but the stone wall that had bordered the kitchen garden was still there. And the old apple tree at the corner of the yard still stood leafless now, in October its branches the particular black of old wet wood. She had climbed that tree when she was 6 years old. She had fallen out of it when she was 7 and broken her wrist, and Dorothy had carried her 2 miles to the doctor's office because they did not own a car. She stood on the back step and looked at that tree and thought about Harold Webb. Harold Webb had been a heavy man with a habit of tapping his thumb on whatever surface was nearest when he was annoyed, which was frequently. He had smelled of machine oil and cigarettes. He had a voice that got louder as the evening went on and softer again by morning, and the distance between loud and soft was the distance Margaret had learned to navigate as her first understanding of how the world worked. He had left when she was 7 years old. He walked out of the house on a Tuesday morning and did not come back and did not send word, and Dorothy had not spoken his name again, not once in all the years that followed. Margaret had spent 65 years with that man's shadow inside her. Not Harold Webb himself, but what he had taught her, the lesson encoded into her before she was old enough to question it, that she was the kind of person people left. That she was the kind of person who did not get to ask for too much space. That she was at some fundamental level not quite worth staying for. That lesson had outlasted Harold Webb by decades. It had survived her marriage and her children in 8 years in a spare room. It had shaped every accommodation she had ever made, every time she had eaten less, or turned off the heat, or folded herself smaller to fit the space she was given. And the man who had installed that lesson in her was not her father. She said it out loud in the empty yard. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" Not a rhetorical question, a real one with real anger underneath it. The anger of a person who had lived an entire life shaped by a false premise, who had made herself small for decades based on information that was simply not true, who had been given a wound by a man who had no biological claim to wound her at all. The apple tree did not answer. The yard stayed quiet. Margaret stood on the back step until the anger had moved through her and left something more complicated in its place, the particular mix of grief and understanding that comes when you realize that the person who hurt you was doing what they thought was protection. She went back inside. She picked up the second page of Dorothy's letter. "Charles and I were together for almost 2 years before you were born. He was already married. He had a family and a name that mattered to a great many people in this county. When I told him I was expecting, he offered money. I said no. He offered to take you and raise you as his own, with his wife, with his name. I said no to that as well. I was not going to let my daughter grow up as somebody's secret kept in a legitimate household." He didn't argue. He set up the trust instead. He bought the surrounding land and put it in my name. He said it was for you when the time came. I believed him. I still believe that was the truest thing he ever did. I sealed this house because I did not trust what would happen to it after I was gone. The Hargroves are patient people with a long memory and attorneys who know how to wait. If they found out about you before you found this place, they would have challenged everything. They would have tied up the land in court and spent the trust on legal fees and buried the documents under enough process that the truth would never have seen daylight. So I buried the truth first, in a place only you could open, in a place you would only find when you needed it most. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I didn't find a way to say this when I was alive. I want you to know I thought about calling you more times than you would believe. I thought about it most on the days when I imagined you were in trouble and didn't know where to turn. Those were the days I sat with the phone in my lap and dialed the number and let it ring once and hung up because I knew that if I called, I would not be able to send you to this place. I would try to fix it myself the way I always tried to fix things myself, and I was too old and too far away to fix anything anymore. This was the only thing I had left to give you, a door that no one else could open. The last line at the bottom of the second page, the Hargrove family has been trying to buy this land since before you were born. They don't know you exist. Fielding will know what to do. Show him everything. Margaret folded the letter with care. She placed it back in its envelope. She sat at the table and looked at the spread of documents across the maple surface, the deeds and the statements and the returned envelopes and the birth certificate, and she thought about a young woman with no money and no husband who had looked at all the ways the world could take something from her child and had decided instead of fighting those ways to outflank them entirely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily for decades building something that required no maintenance except time and the faith that the person it was built for would eventually need it badly enough to come find it. Then she thought about something Lena Cross had said almost in passing with the same neutral delivery she had used for everything else. Dorothy left a 3-page instruction list. She went through the house methodically checking every item on that list twice a year. 3 pages, front and back on all 3. For 20 years, Dorothy had written those instructions knowing she would not be here to see them used, knowing that some woman someday would climb these stairs and open this door and find the furniture still whole, and the cast iron still seasoned, and the well pump still primed. She had written those instructions for a stranger who had not yet arrived, except the stranger was her daughter, and Dorothy had known that too. Margaret got up from the table. She went to the sitting room and pulled her coat from the davenport and put it on. She found the shoelace-tied suitcase in the corner and opened it and took out a pair of flat shoes and put them on her bandaged feet, wincing once and then settling. She gathered the documents from the kitchen table, stacked them carefully, and placed them back in their respective boxes. She carried all 4 boxes to the sitting room. She needed a lawyer. She had a name. She had an address from the business card in the legal box. She had 40 miles of hills between her and the town center, and no car and no phone and no money beyond the 45 cents still in her coat pocket. And she needed to know something before she walked into any lawyer's office. She needed to know who the Hargrove children were now. Charles Hargrove had died in 1992, but his family was still here, still in this county, still sending letters through Albany attorneys to a house where no one had lived for 34 years. She opened the personal box. At the top, newspaper clippings. 3 obituaries for Charles Hargrove from different regional papers, all from 1992. Below them, a folded clipping from 2018, a business profile in a Catskill regional magazine about Hargrove Agricultural Holdings, a land and development company headquartered in Mill Haven. In the photograph accompanying the article, standing in front of what had once been the family dairy operation and was now an office complex, were 2 men and a woman. The caption identified them as Victor Hargrove, 51 president, Thomas Hargrove, 48 vice president of operations, and Patricia Hargrove, 44 director of community development, children of Charles Hargrove. The company had in the past decade acquired several hundred acres of rural land in the county for a mixed-use development project. The article mentioned ongoing negotiations for additional parcels along the Eastern Creek corridor. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. Victor Hargrove had his father's jaw square and deliberate. Patricia Hargrove was smaller, standing slightly to the side in the group photo in a way that suggested she had not entirely chosen to be in it. She put the clipping back in the box. She had half-siblings she had never met. She had a father she had never known. She had 42 acres of land that the company run by her half-brothers had been trying to acquire for years, using attorneys who had never found anyone to address the letters to. They did not know she existed. She was about to make sure they found out. She picked up the 4 boxes. She walked to the front door. She thought about the 40-cent bus fare she did not have and the mile of gravel road between her and the main road and the 6 miles between there and the center of Millhaven. She set the boxes down, went back to the kitchen, and cut 2 thick slices from Lena's bread. She ate them, standing at the counter. Then she picked up the boxes again and went outside into the October morning. She had walked 11 blocks on a disintegrating slipper yesterday with $2.35 in her pocket and nowhere to go. 6 miles to a lawyer's office, who had been waiting 27 years for her to arrive, was not going to stop her now. She pulled the door shut behind her. She went down the porch steps, careful of the third one. She crossed the overgrown yard to the broken gate. She turned onto the gravel road heading west toward town. Behind her, the stone cottage stood in the October light, with its shutters open for the first time in 34 years, the windows catching the sun like eyes that had just opened. Above the door, in a notch in the stone lintel that Margaret had not noticed when she arrived in the dark, there was a small carved mark in the granite, a simple shape, the letter W worn smooth by weather and time. For Whitmore, for the woman who had built this place, and now for the woman who had come to claim it. Nathan Fielding had not expected her to walk. He found out later from Lena Cross that Margaret had covered the 6 miles from the cottage to his office on the foot, carrying a 4 banker's boxes, stopping twice to rest on the low stone walls that bordered the older properties along the county road. By the time she pushed open the door of Fielding and Associates on Main Street, she had been walking for an hour and 40 minutes in a pair of flat shoes over feet that had been bandaged with strips cut from a kitchen towel. She did not mention any of this. She set the 4 boxes on the floor in front of the reception desk and told the young woman behind it that she needed to see Nathan Fielding. The young woman, whose name tag read Brenda, looked at the boxes, looked at Margaret's coat with the dried blood on the left sleeve, looked at the bandaged feet visible above the flat shoes, and reached for the phone with the careful neutrality of someone who has been trained to maintain composure in front of clients, regardless of circumstances. "Do you have an appointment?" Brenda asked. "No. Mr. Fielding is with someone until 11. I'll wait. Can I tell him what this is regarding?" Margaret looked at the 4 boxes on the floor. She looked at Brenda. "Tell him I'm Dorothy Whitmore's daughter, and tell him I brought everything." Brenda picked up the phone. She spoke quietly into it. There was a pause from the other end, brief but audible, even from where Margaret was standing, the pause of a man receiving information that rearranges the morning. Then Brenda set the phone down and said, "He says to come in now." Nathan Fielding was 54 years old, with gray at the temples and the unhurried quality of a man who had learned that most situations in law resolve themselves more cleanly when you do not rush them. He came around his desk when Margaret entered and took the 2 boxes she was carrying without being asked and set them on his conference table. He looked at her face for a moment with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but something in the space between them. "You look like her," he said, not as a pleasantry, as a statement of observed fact. "So I've been told." Margaret set the other 2 boxes on the table herself. "My father said someone would come." Nathan pulled a chair out from the table for her. He didn't know when. He just said to be ready. He went to the credenza behind his desk and opened the bottom drawer. He lifted out a file folder so thick that the brass fastener at the top had been replaced twice over the years, each replacement leaving its mark on the cardboard cover. He set it on the table beside her boxes. On the cover, taped with adhesive that had gone amber with age, was a small piece of paper. The handwriting was not Nathan's. It read, "Open when the girl arrives." Margaret looked at the note. She looked at the date in the corner of the paper. 1998. Nathan Fielding Sr. had written that note 27 years ago and placed it on a file that he had kept current paid taxes from and handed to his son before he died, with instructions to keep waiting. She had spent 8 years believing that no one had thought about her future, that no one had made arrangements on her behalf or set aside anything for her arrival, that she was a woman who moved through the world without leaving enough of an impression for anyone to plan around. She put her hand flat on the table to keep it steady. Nathan Fielding watched her without speaking, which was exactly the right thing to do. When she was ready, she told him everything. She laid the documents out in order across the conference table, the deeds first, then the trust statements, then the legal box with the returned Whitaker letters, and finally the canvas-wrapped box, the birth certificate, in its plastic sleeve. Nathan looked at each item in turn. He asked 3 questions during the entire presentation, each one precise and necessary, each one showing her he had been carrying knowledge of this situation for years and was now simply fitting the pieces he had not previously had access to into a framework he already understood. When she finished, he opened his own file. His father had been Dorothy Whitmore's attorney for 40 years. He had helped structure the original trust with Charles Hargrove in 1971, working from both sides of the arrangement under strict confidentiality. He had paid the property taxes annually from the trust account per Dorothy's standing, written instructions renewed each decade with a notarized letter. He had taken a single additional document into his safekeeping in December of 1988 and had never shown it to anyone. Nathan took it from the file and placed it in front of Margaret. A letter. 2 pages handwritten, the penmanship of an educated man from an earlier generation when such things were still taught as a discipline. Dated December 12, 1988, signed at the bottom with a name Margaret now recognized with a different weight than she had 2 days ago. Charles R. Hargrove. She read it. He had written it 4 years before he died when he was 67 years old, and had apparently arrived at the age when certain debts of conscience become impossible to continue carrying. He wrote about Dorothy with a respect that was not sentimental, the respect of a man acknowledging the full dimensions of someone he had underestimated for most of his life. He acknowledged Margaret as his biological daughter without qualification, without the hedging language of a man protecting himself legally. He affirmed the trust in the land transfer as intentional, permanent, and morally binding on his estate. And he wrote in the second to last paragraph that he hoped Margaret would be allowed to come into what was hers without resistance, and that if she could not, he hoped this letter would serve as whatever instrument of justice a piece of paper was capable of being. The last paragraph was shorter. It said, "Only I did not do right by Dorothy. I did not do right by the child. I cannot undo that. This is the only thing I have left that is worth doing." Margaret set the letter down. She looked at the signature. Charles R. Hargrove in the same hand as the rest of the letter, and below it a notary seal, and below that a witness signature, Harold N. Fielding, attorney at law. Nathan's father had witnessed this letter, had taken it into safekeeping, had told his son before he died to keep waiting for the girl. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. Now Nathan said, "I file." The legal process took 5 weeks from the first filing to the final ruling. Margaret stayed in the cottage during those 5 weeks. Lena Cross brought food twice a week without being asked, leaving it on the porch step with the same absence of ceremony she brought to everything, as if the delivery of groceries to a woman contesting a multi-generational land claim was simply part of a sensible weekly schedule. Nathan handled the paperwork with a thoroughness that suggested he had been preparing for exactly this case for a very long time. The birth certificate was authenticated by the State Vital Records Office within the first week. Dorothy's will, sealed in the Fielding firm's vault since 1991 and never previously opened, named Margaret as sole beneficiary and attached Charles Hargrove's 1988 letter as an exhibit. The chain of title on the 42 acres was clean and unbroken, paid current, legally impeccable. For 11 days, nothing came back from the other side. On the 12th day, Margaret was at the cottage kitchen table reading through the property survey documents Nathan had sent over when she heard a car on the gravel drive. Not Lena's truck, which she knew by sound now. A heavier vehicle moving slowly. She went to the window. A man in a gray suit got out of a dark sedan and stood looking at the cottage with the specific assessment of someone who is calculating rather than admiring. He was perhaps 55, tall, and with the kind of physical solidity that comes from decades of comfort rather than labor. He looked up at the windows. Margaret did not step back. He came to the door and knocked. She opened it. Victor Hargrove in person was something slightly different from his photograph in the regional magazine. The photograph had shown a man confident in his environment, standing on familiar ground in front of a building his family had built. The man on her porch was still confident, but the confidence had a different texture now, more considered the confidence of someone who had recalculated and arrived at a position he intended to hold. "I'd like to speak with you," he said, "without attorneys." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He came in. He looked around the cottage interior with a controlled expression that she recognized as the expression of someone seeing something for the first time that they had thought about for much longer than that. He looked at the maple table, the shelves, the cast iron skillet on its hook. He looked at everything with the attention of a man who understood that the contents of this room were evidence of something he had not expected to still exist. They sat across the table from each other. "I know you're not fabricating this," Victor said. He placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture that was either conciliation or the precursor to a negotiation, and Margaret had been around enough negotiation in her life to know the difference. "I've suspected for years that there was someone. My father said things near the end. Nothing direct, but enough." "Then you know what's in those documents," Margaret said. "I know what you believe is in them. I know what is in them. Your father wrote one of them." Victor's expression did not change, but something behind it did a small interior adjustment. The recalibration of a man who had arrived prepared for a version of this conversation that was turning out to be slightly different from what he had rehearsed. "My family has built this community for 3 generations," he said. "My father's name is on the library, the fire station, the hospital wing. Whatever he may have done privately, that record is real." "I'm not here to take his name off a building," Margaret said. "Then what do you want?" "What my mother left me." Victor looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has spent his life in rooms where directness is the currency of real conversation. "We can resolve this quietly," he said. "A private settlement. You get a fair value for the land, the trust transfers cleanly, and this stays out of the public record." Margaret had heard those words before, not in this room, not about this land, but in their essential structure. "We can resolve this quietly," which meant we would prefer you to take what we offer and disappear. She had been offered that deal in one form or another at every significant moment of her adult life. Take the smaller thing and make less trouble. "My mother spent 34 years making sure this would not be resolved quietly," Margaret said. "She sealed this house. She built a system. She hired a lawyer who trained his son to wait. She did all of that so that when I finally came here, there would be nothing quiet about it at all. I'm not going to undo what she spent her life building." Victor looked at her for a long moment. It was not the look of a man deciding whether to push harder. It was the look of a man understanding that he is sitting across from someone who has already made a decision and made it completely. He recognized that look because he had worn it himself. He stood up. At the door he paused, not turning around, and said, "Our attorneys will be in touch with Fielding." "I know," Margaret said. 3 days later, the Whitaker and Sons attorneys filed their responses. 3 separate motions, each attacking a different element of the claim. The deed authenticity was challenged on the grounds that Dorothy Whitmore had allegedly lacked the legal competence to enter the original land transaction. The birth certificate was challenged as a forgery. The county of issuance questioned the registrar's signature, flagged for examination. The trust was challenged as having been established under duress, with an attached affidavit suggesting that Charles Hargrove had been manipulated by a woman seeking financial advantage. The 4th motion was the one Nathan called Margaret about personally. It requested a psychological competency evaluation for Margaret on the grounds that she was a transient individual with no verifiable fixed address, making extraordinary claims about events from decades past. The word they used in the motion was the word she remembered from the outline of this case she had been building in her head since she first read those returned envelopes in the cellar. "Extraordinary. Extraordinary," she repeated to Nathan on the phone. "They do this when the documents are too strong to attack directly," he said. "They attack the person instead. It's a delay tactic. Can they make it work? Not with what we have. but it will take another 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then we take 4 weeks. Nathan filed responses to all 4 motions inside 48 hours. A handwriting expert from Albany authenticated Charles Hargrove's 1988 letter against 6 known exemplars of his signature from public records. The county registrar's original logbooks confirmed the birth certificate filing. Nathan's own father's case notes from 40 years of representing Dorothy, detailed and dated and stored in the Fielding firm's archive, provided a contemporaneous account of every significant event in the land transaction. And the trust payment records, 53 years of tax receipts, all originating from the same Albany account, formed a chain of documented action that made the word forgery look very small against the weight of evidence. Maxwell Whitaker was 60 years old, white-haired, and had tried cases in this county for 30 years. He was not a man who frightened easily or lost his composure in a courtroom. Margaret watched him at the first full hearing as Nathan placed Charles Hargrove's letter on the table before the judge. She watched Whitaker read it. She watched the 3 seconds of stillness that passed through him as he processed what his own longtime client had written in his own hand in 1988. Those 3 seconds were the whole case. Everything after them was procedure. The hearings ran over 3 weeks. Margaret attended every one. She wore a dark blue dress she had found at the thrift store on Millhaven's main block, one that fit well enough and had the advantage of looking like the clothing of someone who knew where she was going. She sat at the plaintiff's table and she answered every question put to her directly and without ornamentation. When Maxwell Whitaker asked her in the 3rd hearing why she had not visited her mother in 34 years, she did not pause before answering. "Because I was afraid," she said. "I had spent my whole life afraid of taking up too much room. I stayed away from here for the same reason I spent 8 years sleeping in my son's spare room without once asking for what I actually needed. I made myself small because I had been taught very early that small was safer." She let that sit in the room for a moment. "My mother understood that about me. She built this." Margaret gestured toward the stacked evidence files on Nathan's table for the day I would finally run out of road. She knew I would eventually run out of road. The only thing she got wrong was how long it would take. Whitaker did not ask another question. The judge issued his ruling on a Thursday morning in late November, 6 weeks after Margaret had walked into Nathan Fielding's office, carrying 4 banker's boxes in the cut feet of a woman who had walked 6 miles rather than stop moving. The ruling was 23 pages. The operative language occupied 2 paragraphs near the end. The land was hers, the trust was hers, the cottage was hers, and the birth certificate, authenticated by the state and now entered into the public record of the county, was hers in a way that could not be quietly resolved or privately settled or returned to sender. Margaret sat in the courtroom and listened to the ruling being read and felt nothing dramatic. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more durable than either of those things, the feeling of a lock opening after you have found the right combination, the mechanical rightness of a thing fitting the way it was built to fit. Maxwell Whitaker gathered his papers and left without speaking. Victor Hargrove had not attended a single hearing. Margaret and Nathan walked out of the courtroom together into the November light. The maple trees along the courthouse walk had dropped most of their leaves, and the branches were bare against a sky the color of old pewter. Nathan said he would begin the formal title transfer that afternoon. He said the trust would be fully accessible within 10 business days. He said she should call him if she had any questions, and that he would be sending a complete summary of the financial picture by the end of the week. She thanked him. He nodded in the way of a man who has discharged a responsibility he has carried for a long time and is now feeling the specific relief of that weight setting down. He shook her hand and walked to his car. Margaret stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. The air was cold and tasted of coming snow. She could see the water tower with Millhaven painted on it from where she stood, the same letter she had looked up at from the gas station parking lot 6 weeks ago when she had arrived with 45 cents and nowhere left to go. She was about to turn toward her car, the second-hand Civic she had bought 3 weeks into the legal process with a small advance Nathan had arranged against the trust when she heard her name. She turned. The woman standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps was smaller than she appeared in photographs. Patricia Hargrove was 52 years old, and she had the look of someone who had spent the morning deciding whether to come here and had only made up her mind in the last 15 minutes. Her eyes were red in the way that is not from crying at this moment, but from crying earlier privately before arriving. She did not approach. She stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Margaret. I knew he had someone, Patricia said. Not who, not where, but I knew. He talked about it sometimes when he was sick near the end, not clearly. But there are things a daughter understands even when the words aren't complete. Margaret looked at her. Half-sister. The word sat strangely the way new vocabulary always does, before you have lived with it long enough for it to feel like your own. I'm not here to apologize for my brothers, Patricia said. I don't have the right to apologize for Victor. I'm here because I needed to look at you. She paused. And because I wanted you to know that our father thought about you. I believe that. It doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I thought you should hear it from someone who was actually in the room with him. Margaret came down 2 steps, not to close the distance entirely, just enough. I spent 72 years not knowing he existed, she said. I don't need him to have thought about me. My mother thought about me every day for 50 years and built something to prove it. That's what I have. That's what I'm taking with me. Patricia looked at her for a long moment, searching for something in Margaret's face, and whatever she was looking for, she either found or accepted that she would not find it here. She gave a small nod, the nod of someone concluding a thing they came to conclude. I hope the land serves you well, Patricia said. It will, Margaret answered. Patricia turned and walked to a car parked at the curb. Margaret watched until the car was gone. Then she walked to her own car and drove back to Millhaven on the county road she had come to know well over the past 6 weeks, past the grain elevator and the old school and the gravel road that turned east along the creek. Home. Winter came to Millhaven the way it always had, with a week of hard frost, followed by the first real snow on a Friday in December, 6 inches overnight. The fields and the forest and the creek frontage going white and silent under it. Margaret stood at the kitchen window the morning after the snow and drank her coffee and looked at 42 acres of land that belonged to her. She had the roof replaced in early December, a local crew that worked efficiently in the cold. The plumbing followed new pipes from the well to every fixture, the old galvanized lines that had given everything a slight iron taste finally retired. A gas line was run out from the road and connected to the old cook stove, which turned out to need only a new regulator to function as well as it ever had. Electricity came last, the wiring done by a man named Carl Oakes, who had grown up in Millhaven, and who, when he understood whose daughter Margaret was, set his invoice at exactly half his standard rate. Your mother hired me for my first real job, he said, coiling wire in the kitchen with the careful movements of someone who takes pride in a thing done right. I was 18. She needed a fence line rebuilt on the east pasture, paid me fair, and made me redo the corner posts twice until they were level. He did not look up from his work. Some things you don't charge full price for. Margaret let him make that choice without argument, which was itself a new thing for her, accepting someone else's generosity without the reflexive move to diminish it or pay it back immediately. She was learning slowly that receiving was a skill like any other, and that she had spent so many decades refusing to practice it that she was genuinely unpracticed. She kept the tin cup on the windowsill. She kept the empty preserving jars on the kitchen shelf. She kept Dorothy's chair beside the wood stove, which she had cleaned and seasoned and now used every evening while the early dark came down over the fields. She kept the braided rug over the cellar hatch because the cellar was empty now. All its contents either in Nathan's files or in the fireproof box she had bought to keep at home, and the rug had been in that spot for long enough that the floor underneath it was slightly lighter than the boards around it, a permanent record of where it had always been. She leased 20 acres of the North Field to a farmer from the next county over who grew hay and ran a small cattle operation. The lease gave her enough monthly income to be comfortable without touching the trust. She donated 5 acres on the southwestern edge to the town, the parcel closest to the road, where a community garden opened the following spring, the beds built by volunteers on Saturday mornings in April, while the last of the mud was still in the ground. The remaining land she left exactly as it was. The creek ran through the eastern boundary, clear and cold, never frozen entirely, even in January. And the deer paths through the western forest followed routes that had been there far longer than any human claim on the land. She walked those paths on the mornings when the snow was right, following the tracks, not trying to go anywhere in particular, learning the shape of something she owned but did not need to manage. 3 months after the ruling, on a Wednesday evening in February, she called Robert. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to say and had concluded that she did not want to say very much. She did not want a confrontation. She did not want an apology, which would require her to then decide what to do with it. She did not want to reconstruct something that had been revealed under pressure as having been more fragile than either of them had understood. She wanted him to know she was alive. She wanted him to know where she was. She wanted to leave the space between them neither open nor closed, because some things do not resolve, they only change shape. He answered on the second ring. His voice had the careful quality of a man who had been waiting for a call he deserved and had not known when it was coming. She told him she was in Mill Haven. She told him she was well. She told him she had found her mother's house and that it was hers now and that she was staying. He said he was glad she was okay. She said she knew that. 90 seconds. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand afterward and looked at the kitchen around her. The new gas stove, with its pilot lights quiet blue, the cast iron skillet on its hook above it, the tin cup on the windowsill catching the last light of the February afternoon. She thought about the 8 years in Robert's spare room and tried to locate them accurately in the full account of her life, not as the worst thing that had happened to her and not as something to be explained away, but simply as a portion of time she had lived through and survived and was now on the other side of. She thought about Diane, who had wanted her kitchen back and had done a ruthless thing to get it. She thought about Robert, who had turned his back at the one moment it cost him everything. She thought about Gerald, who had died in a garage on a Saturday morning and left a financial wreckage that had taken her 8 years to climb out of, not because he had intended harm, but because he had been a man who confused silence with management. She thought about all of it and felt something that was not quite peace and not quite forgiveness, but was close enough to both that the distinction no longer seemed urgent. The text from Claire arrived on a Saturday in March. "Grandma, are you okay?" Margaret typed back, "I'm better than okay. Come see for yourself." Claire drove up from Philadelphia the following weekend in a used Honda that Margaret could hear from the gravel road before she could see it, the exhaust note of a car being asked to perform at the limit of its capabilities for 6 hours straight. She pulled to the front of the cottage and got out and stood looking at the stone foundation and the new roof and the open shutters with the expression of someone encountering a thing that is both exactly what they expected and nothing like what they imagined. She was 17 years old and she had her grandfather Gerald's coloring and her father Robert's tendency to hold her shoulders slightly forward when she was uncertain, and she was standing in front of a house she had heard about for the first time 2 months ago and looking at her grandmother with the eyes of someone who owes a debt and knows it and does not know the denomination. Margaret came down the porch steps and stopped a few feet away. "I was there that morning," Claire said. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed the thing they need to say. "I heard everything. I didn't do anything." "I know. I should have done something." "Yes," Margaret said. "You should have." Claire blinked. She had perhaps expected absolution in the first breath, the quick reassurance that it was fine, it was all right, no one blamed her. Margaret did not offer that because it was not entirely true and because Claire was 17 and old enough to carry the true version. "I'm not going to tell you it was nothing," Margaret said. "It wasn't nothing. But you are here now, and that is worth more to me than most things." She put her hand briefly on Claire's shoulder. Then she stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Come in. I made lunch." They ate at the maple table, the same table Margaret had pressed her hands against in the dark on the first night, and she told Claire everything. The full account in order, beginning with the bus station and the tin cup at the bottom, and ending with the courthouse steps and Patricia Hargrove's red eyes and the drive home on the county road in the November light. Claire listened without looking at her phone, without the restless, partial attention of a person waiting for a pause to speak. She listened the way someone listens when they understand that what they are hearing is not just a story, but an inheritance. She asked good questions. About Dorothy mostly, about what it meant to build something for someone you were not sure would come, about whether Margaret was angry at her mother for keeping the secret so long. I was, Margaret said, for about an hour in the backyard in the dark with cold feet, and then I read the second page of the letter and understood that my mother was not keeping the secret from me. She was keeping it from the people who would have used it against me before I had what I needed to defend it. Claire thought about that. She trusted you to find it. She trusted me to get to the point where I had no other direction to go. Margaret picked up the tin cup, turned it once in her hand, set it back on the table between them. That's not the same thing as trust in a person's strength. It's trust in a person's survival. She knew I would survive long enough to need it. She just didn't know how long enough would take. Claire left at dusk, standing at the iron gate in the last gray light of the March evening. Before she got in the car, she turned and looked at her grandmother, standing on the porch of a stone cottage that had waited 34 years for the right person and had not fallen down. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know," Margaret answered. The seasons turned. The community garden opened in April, and Margaret spent 2 Saturday mornings helping lay out the beds with the town volunteers, learning which neighbors went by first names and which went by last, accumulating the small knowledge of a place that takes time and presence to gather. In May, she planted tomatoes and basil along the south wall of the cottage where the stone held heat late into the evening. By July, they were producing so aggressively that she brought bags of them to Lena Cross twice a week, who accepted them with the same graceful absence of sentiment with which she accepted everything. Lena Cross became, in the way of things that happened gradually without announcement, the closest thing a Margaret had to daily company. They were not similar women. Lena was brusque, where Margaret was reserved practical, where Margaret was reflective, comfortable with long silences in a way that was native to her, rather than learned from necessity. But they shared the particular understanding of two women who had, each in their own way, spent significant portions of their lives maintaining things that other people did not know needed maintaining. That common ground was enough. They sat on the cottage porch most evenings in the summer, each with a cup looking out over the field where the hay farmers' cattle moved in their slow, deliberate way through the long grass. The creek was audible from there on, still evenings a sound that was less a sound than a quality of the air, the suggestion of cold water over stone, somewhere in the tree line to the east. One evening in late summer, Lena said, "Your mother used to sit here." She said it without preamble, the way she said most things. "When she was young, before you were born, she'd sit on this step and look at that field and not say anything for an hour at a time." Margaret looked at the field. "Did you know her then?" "I was 12 when she left. I remembered her from before. She was the kind of person you remembered." "What kind was that?" Lena thought about it honestly. "The kind who was paying attention to something other people couldn't see." Margaret held her cup. The light over the Catskills was going down in the way it did in late summer, slowly, with a quality of reluctance, the gold deepening before it gave up. She thought about Dorothy sitting on this step young, looking at this same field, carrying a future she could not have fully imagined, but was already in some essential way preparing for. She thought about all the things her mother had not been able to give her, the years of distance, the silence on the other end of a phone that never rang, the absence from her daughter's wedding, her grandchildren's births, the hospital room when Gerald died, and Margaret had sat alone for 4 hours waiting for news that was not going to be good. Dorothy had not been present for any of it, not because she did not want to be, but because the distance she had chosen to protect the secret had required that kind of cost, and she had paid it without complaint and without explanation. Margaret had spent a long time being angry about those absences. She was finished being angry about them now, not because they stopped mattering, because she had finally understood what they had purchased. She looked up at the sky over the cottage where the first stars were beginning to show through the fading blue. She thought about a woman writing 2 pages of instructions by lamplight in November of 1991, knowing she would not see winter outwriting not to a person she was currently in contact with, but to a daughter she had not spoken to in years and might never speak to again. A daughter she had decided to trust was something she had spent decades building. She thought about a woman writing 2 pages of instructions by lamplight in November of 1991, knowing she would not see winter outwriting not to a person she was currently in contact with, but to a daughter she had not spoken to in years and might never speak to again. A daughter she had decided to prepare for a day she could not predict, but was certain would come. The tin cup was still on the windowsill inside. She could see it from where she sat, visible through the kitchen window in the last little light, the same simple curve it had always had, worn smooth at the rim from decades of use before she was born. The first morning she had found it, she had filled it from the well and drunk cold water from it because there was nothing else, and she had been desperately thirsty. It had done its job exactly as intended. That was all most things needed to do. The right thing in the right place, waiting for the right moment with enough faith to outlast the years between the making and the using. Margaret Caldwell was 73 years old. She lived in a stone cottage in the Catskill foothills that her mother had built and sealed and kept safe across 3 decades. She grew tomatoes and basil along the south wall. She walked the deer paths through the western forest on cold mornings. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the light go down over 42 acres of land that belonged to no one else. She did not have a great deal to say about any of it. She was not a woman who had ever required words to confirm the things she understood. She had spent 72 years making herself smaller than she was, and she was taking her time now, expanding back into the space she had always been entitled to, learning, again, the dimensions of a life that fit. Some mornings she picked the tin cup up from the windowsill and held it for a moment before setting it back down. Not as a ritual, not as a gesture of gratitude or remembrance, simply because it was there, and it was real, and the weight of it in her hand was the weight of something that had endured. That was enough. That would always be enough.